Hello, friends. We are accustomed to viewing history with a sort of learned reverence. Dates, congresses, great battles, stern faces in textbooks. But, honestly, behind the scenes of all these monumental events, absolute absurdity often unfolds without any veil. Life is the best screenwriter, and the plots it sometimes delivers could not have been dreamed up by any Hollywood director. Today, we have gathered a new anthology of incredible yet absolutely real facts for you. And today, you will learn how an ordinary Dutch artist, considered a failure, sold a fake painting to Hermann Göring, how a clever guy legally transferred the deed of a building to himself in 10 minutes, and how a 15-year-old student from Detroit managed to assemble a real nuclear reactor in his mother's shed. It will, as always, be very interesting. Don't forget to like and leave a comment. Make yourself comfortable, pour some tea or coffee. Let's get started. Story number 1. The postman who built a perfect palace from stones found on the road. Now listen, imagine France in the late 19th century. A small village near Reef. Silence, roosters, the scent of wildflowers, and endless work. Ferdinand Cheval was the most ordinary village postman. Can you picture him? A bag over his shoulder, dusty boots, a daily route of 30 kilometers. Every morning was the same. Letters, newspapers. Good morning, madam. How's the harvest, sir? Day in and day out. Life seemed planned down to the minute, but Ferdinand had his own world in his head. By the way, he wasn't even an architect at all. But one day, while walking his usual path, his foot caught on something strange. He looked down and saw a stone, but not just any stone. No, it was limestone of incredible, whimsical shape. Something stirred within him. Cheval picked it up, then another, and another. In the evening, on his way home, he was no longer just walking. He was carrying a whole handful of treasures. The next day, he returned with a basket, then with a wheelbarrow. Listen, this went on for 33 years. 33 years, every single day after his shift, tired, with feet aching from walking, he brought home stones. His neighbors? Of course they rolled their eyes. The local postman has completely lost it, they said, collecting trash, building something incomprehensible in his garden. But he remained silent. He simply placed stone upon stone, cemented them together, and sculpted shapes with his fingers that only he could see. And you know what it resulted in? A perfect palace. Not some shed, but a true work of art made of shells, stones, and pebbles. A temple of nature, as he called it. There were staircases leading to nowhere, towers adorned with whimsical animals, and walls on which he immortalized his dreams. When Ferdinand finished, people began to come to him not just from the village, but from all over the country. He became famous while still remaining that same simple postman. When you look at his castle today, you understand that to create a miracle, you don't need millions or an education. You just need to see beauty where others see ordinary road dust and have the patience to carry your first stone home. Well, can you smell that scent of old limestone and determination? This is just the beginning. Friends, we spend a great deal of time fact-checking. All the primary sources are provided in the description. But if you happen to spot an error in the story, let us know in the comments. We'll double-check the facts and be sure to correct ourselves in the next episode, crediting your comment. Now, let's move on. Story number 2. How an entire army became potato strategists. Did you know that sometimes to win, you don't need cannons, swords, or even serious intentions? Honestly, if someone decided to make a comedy about one of the naval battles during World War II, it would be considered too absurd for Hollywood. But facts are stubborn things. Imagine an ocean, night, fog, and the silence so profound that you can hear a sailor's heart beating. An American destroyer, the Onan, is patrolling the calm waters somewhere around the Solomon Islands. Silence, boredom, tea in mugs goes cold, and suddenly a silhouette. Out of the darkness, like a ghost, a Japanese submarine emerges, right on the course. Can you imagine? Huge, black, predatory. The crew of the destroyer freezes. What to do? The Americans realize there's no time to turn around. Running to the guns or loading torpedoes would take forever. And then, in this completely absurd situation, one of the sailors on the deck grabs the first thing that comes to hand. And do you know what they had laying around? Whole crates of premium potatoes. And then, it became a sheer fantasy. The Americans began tossing potatoes directly at the Japanese sailors who were just coming onto the submarine's deck. You understand, right? Potatoes flying through the night, crashing into the sides, falling onto the enemy's heads. And what does the crew of the submarine do? In complete darkness, they decide that these aren't vegetables, but the latest Japanese hand grenades. Just imagine the enemy's horror. From the darkness, grenades are whistling through the air, which for some reason are splatting and not exploding. The Japanese, in a panic, rushed to their posts, began an emergency dive to save themselves from the potato bombardment. Their submarine sank below the surface, and the destroyer slipped past, saving both lives and the ship. The Americans stood on the deck, clutching the last tubers, and they were probably laughing so hard that the entire area could hear them. But isn't it a miracle? To think of that. To send a submarine to the bottom using dinner. By the way, this incident became a true legend among sailors. It entered history as an example that in any situation, even the most desperate, if you have imagination and a crate of potatoes, you are a winner. We often fear difficulties, waiting for something monumental. Yet sometimes, the solution lies right in our pantry. What would you choose, a cannon or a bucket of potatoes in such a situation? Are you ready to find out who else in history showed such extraordinary resourcefulness? Let us know in the comments how you would name such an operation. In the meantime, let's continue. Story number 3. An artist who painted the truth right under the nose of tyranny. Have you ever thought that the most powerful weapon isn't always a gun or even a sharp tongue? Sometimes it's just an ordinary pencil, but not in the hands of some free artist, rather in the hands of a prisoner who has nothing to lose. Picture hell on earth, a concentration camp where each day, each hour is soaked in fear. Mikhail Sokolov, a talented artist, found himself there, behind barbed wire. What could he possibly do? It seemed impossible to draw when even the slightest movement could cost him his life. But listen further. The camp commandant, a man of harshness, almost devoid of emotions, had one, let's say, weakness. He adored his own grandeur. When he learned that there was an artist among the prisoners, he commanded, "Draw the leaders, make them look like gods, like great conquerors." Mikhail had a choice, refuse and disappear or obey the tyrant's will. He chose the incredible path. He began to draw portraits of the leadership, one after another. Faces full of pomp, steely gazes, immaculate uniforms. The commandant was thrilled. He gazed at the paintings Mikhail created furtively, often on scraps of paper or even on pieces of plywood, and felt like the master of the universe. He praised the artist, gave him a bit more bread, sometimes even allowed him to work in warmth. But no one, hear me, no one among those in uniform noticed the main point. Mikhail was a genius of detail. In these portraits, where the leaders gazed down upon the world, in the folds of their uniforms, in the shadows behind their backs, in barely visible cracks on their faces, he hid the truth. He painted eyes where pain reflected, hands that reminded one of the suffering of the prisoners, and even the camp's barbed wire woven into the patterns on their epaulets. This was a visual code only the prisoners could see. For the commandant, these were triumph paintings, but for the prisoners, they were an anthem of resilience. It was a game on the edge of a precipice. Mikhail risked every day, every second. Can you imagine the steel endurance a person needs to look into the eyes of their tormentor and smile while portraying their grandeur, hiding in brushstrokes everything the tormentor wanted to erase from people's memories? He survived, can you believe it? He went through all of this and emerged into freedom, leaving behind not just paintings, but proof that even in utter darkness, the human mind is capable of creating light. His art became a symbol that truth cannot be locked behind a fence, even when you're painting it right before the eyes of those trying to extinguish it. Well, admit it, it gives you chills. People like Mikhail remind us that even in the most hopeless situations, we always have a choice to let our hands drop or to turn our pain into art. What profession of yours could become your salvation if, God forbid, everything changed? Think about it. Story number 4. How 2 monks stole the secret of silk in their staffs. Did you know that once in China, disclosing the secret of silk production could simply, well, cost someone their head? It was the most guarded secret in the world for nearly 3,000 years. No one, hear me, no one could learn how tiny caterpillars transformed into the finest fabric. Emperors kept this under lock and key, guarding trade like the apple of their eye. But is it possible to quell curiosity when incredible wealth is at stake? In the 6th century, 2 Byzantine monks working for Emperor Justinian decided they had had enough of depending on Eastern caravans. The emperor wanted his own silk, and these two, shall we say, agreed to help. But how could they steal the secret when Chinese guards were checking every passerby? The monks set off on a journey that spanned years, through mountains, deserts, past bandits. All the while, they devised one very clever plan. They understood that they couldn't carry live caterpillars. They would simply perish on the road. But the monks were not only faithful, but also, it seemed, born engineers. They hollowed out their bamboo staffs. Yes, they carved them out from the inside. When they finally reached the place where silkworms were raised, they waited for the moment when the caterpillars would lay their tiny eggs. Imagine the scene. 2 monks, pretending to search for shelter, stealthily collecting thousands of these tiny eggs and carefully hiding them in their bamboo staffs. Then came the return journey. Thousands of miles again, facing the fear of each inspection, the guards at the borders saw only 2 humble old men with their battered sticks. Who would have thought that within those dry bamboo canes was hidden an entire empire of the future? When they returned to Constantinople and opened their staffs before the emperor, something incredible began. The eggs hatched and the caterpillars started to eat mulberry leaves. Soon all of Europe learned how to make that legendary silk. This was perhaps the boldest case of industrial espionage in history, carried out by people who seemingly were meant to do nothing but prey. This story proves that if you have a goal and a bit of, well, let's say unconventional thinking, even a simple staff can become a tool that changes the world economy. By the way, this is how one small bamboo stick robbed the East of its monopoly on luxury. Have you ever tried to extract something incredible using only makeshift tools? At least to open a can with a letter opener? That too is a small victory, isn't it? Story number 5. How an ordinary shoemaker captured an entire city and arrested the mayor. Have you ever thought that clothing makes the man? Well, quite literally. In the early 20th century in Germany, there lived a man named Wilhelm Voigt, a simple shoemaker, a man without a penny to his name, who spent a fair amount of his life behind bars for petty theft. He was just unlucky. It happens. He was released once again from prison and felt terribly insulted. There was no work, no proper documents, and in Germany at that time, without papers, you were, excuse me, simply nobody. So one day, he was walking down the street and he saw in the shop of an old flea market dealer a second-hand uniform of a captain from the Prussian army, worn out, complete with epaulets and some medals. In short, it looked impressive. Wilhelm tried it on, and suddenly, magic happened. In the mirror, there is not a former convict, but an officer before whom any official would stand at attention. And in his mind, it clicked. What if I play a game? Listen carefully. This is a ready-made script for an adventure film. Voigt put on his uniform, stepped out onto the square by the train station, caught a couple of real soldiers passing by, and commanded them. "Follow me, we have a secret mission." The soldiers, seeing the captain, didn't make a sound. They stood at attention, saluted, and followed him. Just like that. Where? To the town of Köpenick. They arrived at the town hall. Wilhelm entered, confident as if he were the Kaiser himself, and informed the stunned mayor, "You are under arrest by order of the higher command." The mayor was shocked, eyes wide, starting to demand identification. Foyk merely furrowed his brow and added, "I have an order, and I do not intend to argue." And you know what? The mayor believed him. He handed over the keys to the safe, allowed himself to be arrested and taken away in a car. Foyk calmly took the town's treasury, which, by the way, contained a very respectable sum of money, and headed to the station. The soldiers stayed behind to guard the building, awaiting further instructions. While the mayor sat in a cell pondering what he had done, Wilhelm changed into civilian clothes, hid the money, and simply disappeared. He was caught later by chance, but when all of Germany learned about this story, people were rolling with laughter. They laughed so hard at the authorities that even the Kaiser himself is said to have appreciated the irony of the situation, and after some time, pardoned the captain. You see, the entire government machinery, all order, all these officials, crumbled before one man in a shabby uniform, because no one dared to question the authority of the uniform. We are sometimes taught to respect statuses and ranks, but this story is the best proof that sometimes behind a facade of greatness hides an ordinary cobbler. The main thing is the belief in what you do, and of course, putting on your uniform at the right moment. Story number 6. A man who controlled the fate of the weather using 12 live leeches. Listen, have you ever tried to predict the weather not by looking at your smartphone, but by observing a jar of leeches? Seriously. In the mid-19th century, there was such a man, Dr. George Mary Ozer. Now imagine the English coastline, eternal storms, ships wrecking on cliffs because no one knew when disaster would strike. Ozer was not just a doctor, he was obsessed with the idea of hearing the approach of a storm in advance. He devised a device he called an atmospheric predictor. Listen, it was a real-time machine, but for nature. In the center stood a round structure, and around it there were 12 glass bottles, each housing a leech. Yes, a regular leech. Each was attached to a tiny chain connected to a small hammer. As soon as the leech sensed the approach of low pressure, that is, a storm, it began to move restlessly and climb out of the water, tugging on the chain. The little hammer would strike a tiny bell. Can you imagine that sound? In the doctor's room, in the middle of the night, the first bell suddenly began to ring, followed by the second, and then the third. If a real orchestra started, it meant it was time to run to the port and warn the sailors. "Men, leave! Trouble is coming!" And, I swear, it worked almost flawlessly. The doctor set up his device, and in an entire year, he did not miss a single serious storm. The bells rang, and people were saved. But you know what's the funniest part? His fellow scientists looked at his invention, spun a finger at their temples, and said, "George, what are you thinking? Leeches and bells?" That's ridiculous. They simply dismissed his invention, locked it away in a dusty corner, and forgot about the device for 100 years. If only they had listened to those living barometers, how many lives could have been saved? Now that device is in a museum, and it still works. Can you believe it? We spend billions on satellites and supercomputers, yet someone in the 19th century solved the problem using a dozen leeches and a couple of copper bells. What irony! We so often search for answers in complicated things that we just stop noticing the clues right at our feet. By the way, have you ever come up with a brilliant idea, but no one listened to you because it was too strange? Isn't that frustrating? But it's okay. Time puts everything in its place. Story number 7. How one silly typo on a map created a town that became a reality. Have you ever thought that the most ordinary mistake, say an extra letter or a missed comma, could change geography? I swear, cartographers are serious people, but even they sometimes make blunders. In the mid-20th century, in the American state of New York, a dot labeled a glow appeared on a map in the middle of nowhere. No one lived there, not a single house, not a single lamppost, just a name on a piece of paper. Now imagine, at the same time, a business of making maps was thriving in the States. And do you know what was the cartographer's biggest fear? No, it wasn't getting lost in the woods. It was that someone would simply take their map, redraw it for themselves, and sell it as their own, without paying a single cent. true pirates of the ink and paper world. To catch these thieves in the act, cartographers from one well-known company came up with a clever trick. They drew a fictional little town, the very Aglo, and placed it right in the forest where there was nothing but pines and squirrels. It was a copyright trap. If Aglo appeared on someone else's map, it meant you were caught, thieves. But listen, the most interesting thing happened next. Years went by, and some traveler wandered into those parts, looked at his map, saw Aglo, found some old barn or abandoned forest lookout and thought, "Oh yes, Aglo, I'm here." Following him, an entrepreneur came along, built a little shop to sell coffee and souvenirs to tourists, and hung a sign, "Welcome to Aglo." And voila! A town that was born from a mistake and the desire to deceive came to life. Do you see the irony of fate? People started stopping there. Mail began arriving at the address of Aglo, and even navigation systems started plotting routes there. A fictional point on the map, born from curiosity and a twist of fate, suddenly transformed into a real place. A city that had no right to exist in the first place suddenly became part of our world. By the way, when the real creators of the map later went to court against competitors, they had to admit, no, there is no Aglo. It's just our invention to catch you. But it was already too late. The little shop stood there, people started going in, and the point on the map became a reality. It turns out that sometimes our mistakes are not just mistakes, but doors to some new, amazing reality that we nourish with our belief. Isn't that a miracle? We are used to everything being by the rules, and the world flipped the script, turning lies into truth. Story number 8. The quietest concert in history, which made people listen to silence. Have you ever tried sitting in absolute silence? Like, completely silent, where even the dust settling on the carpet sounds like a deafening crash. In the middle of the 20th century, there lived an eccentric composer named John Cage. He saw the world as a giant musical instrument. One day, in 1952, he decided to put on a performance that drove half of America's musical elite to a nervous twitch. He went on stage, sat at the piano, placed before him sheets of music, note that they were blank papers, and started a stopwatch. Then he just sat there. A minute passed, then 2, then 3. The audience started to squirm. Someone coughed. Someone whispered indignantly. Everyone was waiting. When is he going to strike the keys? But Cage didn't budge. He continued for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, then stood up, bowed, and left. Do you know what the essence was? People expected music. They came to listen to the composer, and, in the end, they had to listen to themselves. In those 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the hall turned into a symphony of everyday life. Someone rustled a program. An air conditioner hummed somewhere in the distance. Someone sighed nervously or squeaked a chair. It wasn't silence. It was the music of chance, the music of life that we usually drown out with our endless activities. To be honest, many thought he had simply lost it. Critics wrote scathing articles, claiming it was not art, but mockery. But years later, people began to understand. Cage gave them the most valuable gift, a pause. In a world where everything constantly buzzes, moves, and demands attention, he made hundreds of people remain silent for 5 minutes and hear how the air sounds. Imagine this scene. Hundreds of respectable people in expensive suits sitting in a dark hall, intently listening to the creaking of the floorboards. I hope that is the essence of it. It is pure genius, mixed with the boldest joke in the history of music. He showed us that we are constantly surrounded by sounds, yet so accustomed to the noise that we stopped hearing life itself. By the way, this piece is still performed by orchestras all over the world. And every time there's someone who is outraged that they wasted their time, and someone who leaves the concert with completely different eyes. Story number 9. How the Pirate Queen retired with pockets full of gold. Listen, have you ever heard about a woman who commanded a fleet larger than the entire army of some country and managed to leave the game as a victor? Forget about movies with treasure chests and one-legged captains. In the early 19th century, somewhere in the waters of the South China Sea, there lived a lady named Qing Shi. She was not just a mere rebel, she was a true queen, whose fleet numbered, imagine this, 80,000 people. That's a whole city on water. Huge junks with crimson sails, hundreds of captains, thousands of sailors. All of this was under the command of one woman. They had their own laws, their own rules, and even social protection for those who were injured in battle. Can you imagine the level of organization that any modern business coach would be envious of? She instilled fear in all the coastal cities, plundered ships right before the eyes of local authorities, and no one, hear me, no one could deal with her. But the most fascinating part is not the pillaging. The most interesting events began when the Chinese government realized that fighting her was futile. They tried sending a fleet, they tried bribing her people, but Qing Shi was too cunning. Ultimately, the government decided to negotiate. Yes, picture this. High-ranking officials, dressed in heavy silks, sat down at the negotiating table with a woman for whose head they had proposed mountains of silver just yesterday. And you know how this drama ended? She laid down such terms that the officials had no choice but to agree. She demanded full amnesty for herself and her people, the preservation of the stolen riches, and the right for her captains to hold government positions in the army. And they agreed. Can you imagine the audacity? She not only emerged without a scratch, but she exited this business with honors, money, and status. She opened a gambling house, lived to old age in complete comfort, and, if the chronicles are to be believed, lived a life that many kings could only dream of. Without any duels or betrayals in the end, she simply pulled off the deal of her life. While other pirates ended their careers on the gallows or somewhere in the cold ocean, she just lowered her weapons and rode off into the sunset, keeping everything she had fought for. That's truly incredible, isn't it? A woman who broke the very system, made the rulers of a great empire play by her rules, and won without ever losing. Story number 10. How a ginger cat managed an entire city for 20 years without taking bribes. Listen, have you ever looked at a ballot with the thought, there's really no one to vote for? But you know, these respectable people in identical suits with their perfect smiles and endless speeches that put you to sleep. We've gotten used to sighing and checking the box next to the one who annoys us just a little less. But the residents of one tiny town decided they had enough, and their decision was so absurd it became a part of history. Picture Alaska, 1997, in the town of Talkeetna. It's a harsh, snowy place where there are sometimes more bears than people. The population is at most 900 individuals. Everyone knows each other by face. There's silence, the crunch of snow beneath boots, and a cozy glow from the windows of local diners. Then the day of the mayoral elections approaches. The townsfolk look at the list of candidates and realize it's a dreary situation. None of the politicians inspire the slightest enthusiasm. Arguments in the local store heat up. And then someone looks down and sees a box. A plain cardboard box that someone has left right at the supermarket door. Inside are kittens. One of them, a bold orange one with a short stubby tail, looks at the people as if he already knows how to solve all their problems. He was named Stubbs. In that moment, someone comes up with a completely insane idea. What if they write the name of this orange fluff ball on the ballots? It's just ridiculous. A protest vote, so to speak, to show the politicians their true place. People began passing this idea around. Let's vote for Stubbs. Election day came. The commission starts counting the votes. One vote for the cat, then another, and another. And by the 10th vote, guess what? When the counting ended, it turned out that the orange stray had won by a landslide. An absolute majority of the townspeople chose an animal as their leader that couldn't even open a can by itself. Stubbs became the honorary mayor of Talkeetna. Do you think this was just a one-time joke? Not at all. He was given an official office right at the counter of the very store where he was found. The mayor's work schedule was strict but fair. In the morning, he would inspect the premises and check the quality of fresh milk. In the daytime, he would nap on the coziest sweaters in the clothing department. And every day, at exactly 4 o'clock, the mayor had an important meeting at a nearby cafe. The waiter would bring him a glass of margarita, filled to the brim with water and sprinkled with catnip. Stubbs would slurp his cocktail, graciously accepting scratches from his constituents. And amazingly, this cat turned out to be the best economic strategist in the town's history. When the news about the fluffy politician spread across the country, streams of tourists flooded into Talkeetna. People from across the ocean traveled thousands of kilometers on snowy roads just to take a photo with the mayor who couldn't lie. Souvenir shops thrived. Hotels were completely booked. The town's economy soared to new heights. He never raised taxes, nor was he ever implicated in a corruption scandal. If Stubbs was dissatisfied with his subordinates, he simply went to sleep in his corner or meowed loudly. He held his position for an incredible 20 years, being re-elected time and again, because no human could ever offer anything better than the honest purring of a cat. Honestly, this story always brings a smile to my face. We often complicate our lives, building cumbersome management systems, arguing until we're hoarse, and sometimes all a city needs for happiness and prosperity is a little humor and one orange cat with a short tail. What do you think would be the perfect pet to lead your company or city? Perhaps a phlegmatic turtle for the finance department? Interesting thought. Story number 11. How hired actors made the whole world roll shopping carts. Have you ever caught yourself thinking that the most convenient and brilliant inventions of humanity are initially met with resistance? Seriously, we are horrendous conservatives. We crave the old, the inconvenient, but familiar. The story I'm about to tell you is a classic example of how human stubbornness almost doomed a simple yet great invention. Imagine America at the end of the 1930s, a typical supermarket. The owner of a small grocery chain named Sylvan Goldman sits in his office, gloomily staring out the window at the sales floor. He sees a problem that is literally stealing his money. Shoppers take small woven or wire baskets, wander between the aisles, fill them with canned goods, bread, milk, and as soon as the basket becomes heavy and starts to strain their arms, that's it. They stop shopping and head to the checkout. Their arms give out. Sylvan thinks if only they could carry more, they would buy more. But how to make that happen? He can't strap baskets to their backs. Then, one night, alone in his empty office, he glances at a regular folding wooden chair. Wait, what if he attached wheels to the legs of that chair and put a basket on the seat? And another one underneath? He immediately calls his mechanic. They take iron pipes, wheels, and bolts. They saw, hammer, and probably argued. By morning, they've assembled something strange. A two-tiered cart on wheels, the first grocery cart in the world. The day of the grand premiere arrives. Goldman orders a whole batch of these gleaming chrome carts, lines them up perfectly at the entrance of the store, and hires a cheerful young woman to offer them to every customer walking in. He rubs his hands together, anticipating triumph. But then, complete disaster strikes. People walk into the grocery store. The woman cheerfully extends a cart to them, and the shoppers recoil from it as if it were leprosy. They grab their old, heavy hand baskets and sweat between the shelves. Goldman can't take it anymore. He steps onto the sales floor and starts asking people, why? It's so convenient. And here unfolds the astonishing psychology of humanity. Men indignantly puffed out their chests and declared, what, do you think I'm weak? Can't I carry my groceries myself? I'm a man, not disabled. Meanwhile, women waved him off in annoyance. Listen, I've pushed a stroller around parks enough to have my back ache. The last thing I need is to be rolling your metal contraption around the store. That was it. The idea had failed. The warehouse was filled with useless scrap metal. Any other person in Sylvan's place would have given up and written off the losses. But he was not just a merchant. He was a genius who understood how the crowd works. Do you know what he did? He didn't argue. He went to a modeling agency. Yes, he hired professional actors, statuesque, incredibly handsome men in sharp suits and elegant women in fashionable dresses. He paid them decent money just to walk around his store all day with those very carts. The actors lazily rolled the carts with 2 fingers, exchanged sweet smiles, casually tossed items into the carts, and looked like they owned the world. And then ordinary shoppers entered the store. They saw this scene, and in their minds, the switch of the herd instinct flipped instantly. Wow, it turns out this is incredibly fashionable. Look at these respectable people using them. And here I am, sweating like a fool with my basket. And just like that, the magic worked. Within a few days, ordinary shoppers started fighting over these carts at the entrance. After a month, Goldman could not keep up with production. In a couple of years, he became a multi-millionaire. His invention forever changed the way we buy food. Just like that, simple human pride almost deprived us of comfort, while a clever manipulation saved it. Honestly, whenever I'm pushing a heavy cart to the checkout, I always remember those men who tried to prove their strength with cans of beans. Story number 12. The girl who invented her own kingdom and deceived the elite. Listen, have you ever caught yourself thinking that people are more willing to believe in a beautiful fairy tale than in a boring truth? Seriously, that's how we are. If something exotic, mysterious, and a bit romantic is presented to us, our critical mind just shuts off. And the story I'm about to tell is a perfect example of how far one can go with just audacity and a rich imagination. Imagine England, the early 19th century, 1817 to be exact. A small town called Almonbury. The evening has the damp, typical British weather. A girl, dressed strangely in rags with a turban on her head, knocks on the door of the local cobbler, speaking a language unlike any known one. She looks lost, exhausted, and clearly in need of help. The cobbler, being a kind man, leads her to the local magistrate. And here the real spectacle begins. The magistrate, his wife, local aristocrats all rush to see this wonder. The girl does not understand a word of English. She communicates with gestures, draws strange symbols, refuses meat, and drinks only water. When they show her images of China or India, she shakes her head. But when someone brings a book about the islands of the Pacific, she joyfully points to a picture. The locals are thrilled. Their town has a real exotic spectacle. And just as if on cue, a certain Portuguese sailor appears in Almonbury. He looks at the girl, listens to her mutterings, and solemnly declares, "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand her language." This is Princess Caraboo from the island of Javaso, located in the Indian Ocean. Can you imagine the public's reaction? A princess, a real live princess in a remote area. According to a sailor translator, the poor thing was kidnapped by pirates, taken far from home. But she managed to escape by jumping overboard and swimming to the English shore. That's it, the town went wild. Princess Caraboo was settled into the finest house. Local seamstresses ran around, sewing her silk garments embroidered with gold. After all, a royal can't go around in rags. Artists painted her portraits, aristocrats lined up to see her perform her exotic dances, or pray to some god of hers while climbing a tree. She was written about in London newspapers. She was the talk of high society. England was charmed by this noble savage. She reveled in the attention and dined on the finest delicacies. By the way, she quickly developed a love for meat, and everything was going perfectly. For 2 whole months, she dazzled the entire British elite. But as often happens, the fairy tale ended due to a silly accident. One day, the owner of a cheap boarding house from a neighboring town walked into the house where Caraboo was living. She glanced at the princess, who was majestically sipping tea at that moment, and exclaimed, "Goodness, that's Mary Wilcox, the shoemaker's daughter from Devonshire." A stunned silence, shock, denial. But the truth came out. There was no princess. There was only a made-up language, a talented actress, and a Portuguese sailor who seemingly played along for fun or a bit of fame. Mary was an ordinary maid who had run away from her dull life and decided to have some fun. And do you know what's most surprising? When the deception was uncovered, no one punished her. On the contrary, those very aristocrats she had so cleverly deceived were so impressed by her talent and audacity that they paid for her ticket to America. They figured, since you are so enterprising, try your luck in the New World. Honestly, this story always makes me smile. We are so afraid of seeming foolish that we are ready to believe any nonsense as long as it's beautifully packaged. Mary Wilcox proved that the boundaries of possibility exist only in our minds. Story number 13. The artist who tricked daring into buying a fake and became a national hero. Listen, have you ever thought that revenge can be not only sweet, but painted in oil? Seriously, we tend to think of art forgery as a crime, a deception that lands one behind bars. But what if a forgery is so good that it tricks the most notorious villains of its time, and the creator, instead of being condemned, becomes a national hero? Picture the Netherlands, the 1930s. Hermann Göring, an artist, a man undeniably talented, but with one tiny issue. Critics can't stand him. They claim his style is outdated, that he paints like he did 300 years ago, that there's not a drop of originality in him. Can you imagine what it's like to hear every day that you have no talent, even though your hand confidently holds the brush? Kahn is furious. He's so angry that he decides to take revenge. And his plan for revenge is simply brilliant. He decides to prove to those pretentious art historians that they know nothing about painting. What does he do? He takes old canvases from the 15th century, washes off the paint, and then spends long months experimenting with techniques, mixing pigments exactly as the masters of the past did. He even invents a special kiln to bake the paintings, creating craquelure, those tiny cracks that appear on the canvas with age. And so he paints a picture in the style of Jan Vermeer, one of the greatest and rarest artists of the Netherlands. The painting is called Christ in Emmaus. Kahn submits it to one of the most respected experts of the time. And you know what? The expert looks at the canvas, cries tears of joy, and declares to the world, "This is a masterpiece, the best work by Vermeer we have ever found." Van Mihagera rejoices. He has outsmarted the smartest people in Europe, but he doesn't stop there. Why stop when it brings in colossal money? He paints several more Vermeers and sells them for outrageous sums. He becomes obscenely rich, buys dozens of houses, and lives like a king. But the most interesting events unfold during World War II. The Netherlands is occupied, and then Hermann Göring enters the scene, one of the most influential people in the Third Reich, known for his passion for art. Göring manically buys masterpieces all over Europe, and of course, he wants to acquire a new Vermeer. Kahn sells him the painting Christ and the Sinner for an astronomical sum. Göring is thrilled. He takes his masterpiece to Germany, believing he possesses the greatest treasure. The war ends. The Allies find Göring's collection, and here's where it gets amusing. They see the painting by Vermeer and start searching for the one who sold national heritage to the enemy. The trail leads back to Kahn van Meyergeer. He is arrested. He faces the death penalty for treason. And that's when Kahn realizes he's caught in his own trap. He sits in prison and thinks, if I remain silent, I'll be executed as a traitor. If I tell the truth, I'll be imprisoned as a fraud. And he chooses the truth. He tells the court, "Gentlemen, I am not a traitor. I did not sell anything to Göring. I simply conned him with a fake that I painted myself." The investigators are stunned. The art historians are furious. How is this a fake? They themselves declared it authentic. Nobody believes Kahn, and then he proposes a deal. "Bring me a canvas, paints, and brushes. I will paint you a new Vermeer right here in my cell." And he paints. Under the watch of guards and experts, he creates another masterpiece. The court is bewildered. It turns out this humble artist, whom everyone considered talentless, managed to deceive the best experts in the world and, most importantly, trick one of the top Nazis, extracting enormous money from him for a piece of old canvas with baked paint. The court finds him guilty of forgery, but the people of the Netherlands are thrilled. For them, he became a hero, a man who outsmarted the enemy and proved to all those pretentious snobs that they were blind. Kahn Negron received only 1 year in prison, but his name will forever be remembered in history as the name of the most ingenious forger of all time. Honestly, this story always reminds me that revenge can be quite creative. We often get upset by criticism, forgetting that the best way to prove our point is to create something that everyone believes in. Have you ever caught yourself doing something just out of spite to demonstrate your genius? Maybe you prepared dinner using a restaurant recipe and claimed you ordered takeout. Story number 14. How two American teenagers accidentally made a radioactive shed glow in the dark. Listen, do you remember yourself at 15? What did you do after school? You probably played soccer, tried to form a rock band in a garage, or fixed a bicycle that was falling apart while riding it? Normal teenage stuff, right? Now, imagine a kid named David Kahn, the early 90s, suburb of Detroit. A typical house, a neat lawn, and mom baking pies. And David? Well, David decided that collecting stamps was boring. He wanted to build a nuclear reactor in his backyard. I swear, I'm not joking. He had no sinister plans for world domination, he just loved chemistry. You know, the classic nerd in glasses who was engrossed in old Soviet and American physics textbooks that claimed atomic energy was the bright future of humanity. David thought, why not give it a try? He had a shed in the backyard that his mother allowed him to use as a laboratory so he wouldn't blow up the kitchen, and there had already been incidents, by the way. And this is where it gets truly astonishing. Where does a 15-year-old kid find radioactive materials? Uranium is not sold in supermarkets, but David was incredibly resourceful. He started writing letters to nuclear agencies, posing as a high school physics teacher supposedly preparing a demonstration for students. And you know what? Serious guys in suits sent him brochures, instructions, and even tips on where to find necessary elements in household appliances. It turns out the world around us is radioactive if you know where to look. David bought old watches with glowing dials. They contained radium. He bought dozens of smoke detectors which contained americium. He collected thorium from camping gas lanterns and the third element from old gun scopes. Can you picture this? A kid sitting in a shed, prying open hundreds of smoke detectors, extracting radioactive elements using coffee filters, acid, and aluminum foil, all in secret from his parents, who thought he was just gluing model airplanes together. Listen, this sounds like a script for a sci-fi movie, but he actually built a working model of a breeder reactor using lead blocks, foil, tape, and radioactive sludge. And that thing started to work. The reaction began. True, not quite like at real power plants, but the radiation levels around the shed started to grow rapidly. David realized that everything had spiraled out of control when his Geiger counter began crackling 5 houses away from his yard. The shed literally glowed in the dark when viewed through special devices. The guy got scared. He decided to dismantle his hellish machine, packed everything into the trunk of his old car, and drove somewhere in the woods to bury it. But then came a classic twist. He was stopped by the police. Just for a routine check, the officers asked him to open the trunk, saw some strange lead pipes, wires, and a suspicious powder. David honestly said, "Officers, it's better not to touch this. It's radioactive." You should have seen the faces of those cops. They called in the SWAT team, environmental services, and people in hazmat suits. The whole quiet suburb was cordoned off. Mom's shed was taken apart, board by board, packed into steel barrels labeled as radioactive waste, and hauled off to a special dump in the desert. The neighbors were in shock. Mom was horrified, and David became a legend. The Environmental Protection Agency later calculated that the radiation level in the shed exceeded normal levels by 1,000 times. And all this was done by one stubborn schoolboy with a budget of a few $100s, armed only with curiosity and a chemistry textbook. Honestly, this story always leaves me with mixed feelings. On one hand, it's complete irresponsibility. On the other, just imagine the potential hidden in the human brain if it's directed in the right way. Story number 15. How one bumbling clerk at a bank created the strangest currency in the world. Listen, have you ever thought about how fragile our financial system is? We are used to gold, paper bills, plastic cards, and now even to invisible numbers on our phones. It seems to us that money is something unshakable, backed by laws, safes, and stern faces of bankers. But the story I am about to tell you proves that sometimes the economy can rest on a handshake, chance, and a piece of old leather. Imagine Ireland, the late 70s of the 20th century, 1970 to be precise. The country is facing a mounting banking crisis, not due to any crash on Wall Street. No, it's simply because bank employees decided to go on strike. They were demanding higher wages. The management resisted, and eventually, all the banks in the country locked their doors for 6 months. Stop for a second and grasp the scale of this disaster. For 6 months, no person, no company could deposit money, withdraw cash, or cash a check. All ATMs, though they weren't the modern kind we know, cash registers, and vaults were inaccessible. The country was left without its circulatory system. Cash that was in hand quickly disappeared under mattresses. Trade was supposed to come to a halt, stores were to close, and people were expected to start trading potatoes for shoes. But the Irish are a stubborn and resourceful people, and this is where things get interesting. What do you think they did when the real money ran out? They began drawing their own. Imagine a typical Irish dad. It's evening. The owner of a bar, we'll call him Patrick, is standing behind the counter. A farmer walks in, orders a pint of beer, but has no way to pay. He says, "Paddy, listen, I have 10 cows in the barn. Tomorrow I'll sell the milk. Write me a note on a napkin stating that I owe you £1 sterling. I'll sign it, and I'll bring the money tomorrow." Patrick takes a regular paper napkin and writes, "I, the farmer so-and-so, owe the pub £1. He dates it and adds the farmer's signature, and that's it. The napkin becomes money. The next day, Patrick goes to the butcher for sausages. He has no cash, so he gives the butcher that very napkin from the farmer. The butcher knows the farmer, it's a small town, and he says, "Oh, Jones, yes, he has excellent milk. I trust him." So he accepts the napkin as payment. The butcher then gives that napkin to the baker for bread, the baker to the school teacher for lessons, and so on. Listen, this might sound ridiculous, but during the 6 months of the strike, Ireland switched to an economy based on pieces of paper, napkins, the backs of envelopes, and even bits of cardboard. Promissory notes, or IOU, went into circulation. People wrote them on anything. Once in Dublin, they settled a debt with a piece of dried cowhide on which the amount was burned in and bore the signature of a well-known local trader. Who guaranteed that this money wasn't counterfeit? No one. More accurately, the pubs and shops served as guarantors. If the pub owner, who knew everyone in the area, accepted your paper, it meant your reputation was worth something. Pubs became unofficial centers of the country's banking system. People went there not just to drink, but to cash their napkin checks from neighbors. The economy didn't just survive, it continued to grow. When, after 6 months, the bankers finally reached an agreement with the unions and opened their doors, they expected to see chaos, ruin, and crowds of angry people. Instead, people came with suitcases stuffed with napkins, beer coasters, and pieces of wallpaper covered in millions of signatures. Bankers had to spend months untangling this mess and exchanging the folk art for real pounds sterling. And you know what? Almost all the debts were paid. The level of fraud turned out to be negligible. This story always amazes me deeply. We tend to think that economics involves complex graphs and gold reserves, but it turns out that real money is simply the trust people have in one another. Have you ever lent someone money based on a handshake without signing any papers? Did you get your money back? Story number 16. How an entire city fell into a panic just by looking at their cars from a different angle. Listen, have you noticed how easily our brains can deceive us? Seriously, we are used to trusting our eyes 100%. If I see it, then it exists, right? But the story I want to tell you proves that sometimes the problem lies not in what we see, but in how we look at it. Let's travel to America. Spring, 1954, the city of Seattle. A beautiful time. On the streets roll huge, shiny chrome cars. Jazz is playing on the radio. Life flows steadily and calmly. And so, on one beautiful April morning, an entirely ordinary resident of the suburbs steps outside to his car to head to work. He wipes the windshield with a cloth, and then suddenly freezes. There are tiny pockmarks on the glass, such small dimples, craters, as if someone had bombarded his car with a microscopic cannon during the night. He frowns and calls his neighbor. The neighbor approaches, shakes his head, and then goes to check his own car, and lo and behold, His windshield has exactly the same craters. The men call the police, reporting that hooligans are on the loose, damaging property. The police respond to the call, but by the end of that day, they receive another 10 such calls. The next morning, there are 100 calls. By the end of the week, the police are going insane because the phones are ringing off the hook. People from across the city are reporting mysterious damages to windshields. Over 3,000 vehicles have already been affected. Can you imagine the chaos that ensued? A genuine, uncontrollable mass hysteria. Local newspapers print huge headlines. "Our city is under attack!" People have stopped sleeping at night. Car owners begin to cover their vehicles with thick blankets, tarps, hiding them in garages. But the damages reappeared over and over, and the public's imagination ran wild. Since no hooligans could be caught, it must be something else. One newspaper speculated that it was a new type of acidic sandblasting that arose due to the warm winter. Others insisted that it was cosmic rays penetrating the Earth's atmosphere. The most alarmed citizens whispered that these were radioactive deposits from the ocean that were eating away at glass and would soon start on human skin. The mayor of Seattle was in a panic. He realized that the city was on the brink of chaos. He called the state governor, who sent an emergency telegram straight to the national government. "Urgently save us. We have an unknown phenomenon destroying transportation." And so, federal authorities dispatched a team of serious scientists from the university to the city. Experts, chemists, physicists, forensic specialists. They arrived, set up camp, took out magnifying glasses and microscopes, and began to study these mysterious craters on thousands of pieces of glass. The city held its breath. Everyone awaited the verdict. Aliens, radiation, or mutated insects? After several days, the head of the commission stepped forward to speak with the journalists. He cleaned his glasses, exhaled heavily, and revealed the truth, which turned out to be funnier than any fiction. It turns out there was no epidemic at all. The scientists proved that these tiny pockmarks were simply the result of tiny sand grains, small stones, and road dust that every day hit the glass of any moving car. This is normal wear and tear. Those little dimples had always been there. A month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. But why hadn't people noticed them? The answer is brilliantly simple, because drivers usually look through the windshield at the road, traffic lights, and other people. But as soon as the newspapers reported that someone was damaging windshields in the city, people stepped outside and for the first time in their lives looked not through the glass, but at the glass itself. Their focus shifted a few dozen centimeters closer. And, of course, they noticed the dust particles, scratches, and those tiny microscopic dents. And the brain, frightened by rumors, immediately painted a disaster. People scared themselves with something that had always been right in front of them. As soon as scientists explained this phenomenon on the radio and in the press, the epidemic ended at that very second. The dents stopped appearing because people simply calmed down, got behind the wheel, and began to look at the road again. To be honest, this is one of my favorite stories. It wonderfully illustrates that sometimes problems exist only because we are looking at them too closely. Just change the focus, and a disaster turns into ordinary road dust. Story number 17. The man who sold the tallest skyscraper in 10 minutes. Listen, have you ever considered how trusting we are when we see a beautiful piece of paper with a seal on it? Seriously, it's just a piece of wood that has been processed. But add a couple of fancy letters, the signature of some notary, and we are ready to hand over the keys to our own apartment. The story I'm about to tell is a hymn to human bureaucracy and how easily it can be hacked if you have a little audacity and a ballpoint pen. This took place in America, not in the wild years of the Wild West, but quite recently, exactly in 1998. Imagine New York, the Empire State Building. 381 meters of steel, glass, concrete, and sheer grandeur. One of the most famous and expensive buildings on the planet. How difficult do you think it is to steal such a giant? Well, you would probably need an army of lawyers, international accounts, offshore companies, and years of preparation, right? Not at all. It turned out just one journalist with a very particular sense of humor was enough. His name was William Nishimoto, and he worked for a popular New York newspaper. One day, William was sitting in the editorial office and thought, how protected is our real estate registration system, really? If I want to transfer ownership of, let's say, a hot dog stand to myself, will they check me? And what if it's something bigger? And he decided to conduct an experiment that caused half the city officials to sit up and take notice. William downloaded a standard property transfer form from the internet, a regular form that is filled out when purchasing a shed or a garage. In the property section, he honestly and transparently wrote the address of the Empire State Building. In the seller section, he listed the actual owners of the building, Donald Trump and his Japanese partner. But in the buyer section, he displayed some creativity. He created a fictional company with an absolutely ridiculous name, Lots Properties. Read the first word backward, and you get a hidden message, stolen. But that wasn't all. He needed signatures. As witnesses to the transaction, he listed Fay Wray, the actress from the classic King Kong film, and a notorious bank robber, Willie Sutton. And the notary who certified this absurd transaction was a fictional person named Oibos. And so, armed with this flimsy document, which had the signatures of the Kong's girlfriend and a dead robber, William went to the city's real estate registration department. He stood in line, approached the window, smiled sweetly at the tired clerk, handed over the paper, and paid the fee. It was something around $250. The clerk looked at the document, looked at William, slammed down the stamp, and that was it. Listen, it's just incredible. Within the next 90 minutes, the Empire State Building officially belonged to a fictional company called Stolen Properties in all documents of New York City. 380 meters of concrete changed ownership simply because no one, not a single person in the city system, bothered to read what was actually written on the form. The system operated automatically. There's a paper, there are signatures, real or fake. There's a paid fee, so the transaction is legitimate. Of course, William didn't start collecting rent from thousands of offices. The next day, his newspaper came out with a huge headline on the front page. We stole the Empire State Building. Journalists honestly described the entire process, attached copies of the documents, and returned the ownership rights to the real owners. You should have seen the panic in New York City's City Hall. Officials were tearing their hair out. It turned out that their vaunted computerized registration system didn't actually check names or verify signatures at all. After this article, the city had to urgently change laws, introduce new layers of protection, and hire a bunch of people to verify documents. Honestly, this story always gives me a nervous chuckle. We put so much faith in systems, in computers, in complex processes, but in reality, it often comes down to one tired person with a stamp who just can't be bothered to read the fine print. Story number 18. The man who hacked the roulette system using dust and a stopwatch. Listen, have you ever dreamed of beating the casino? You know, stepping into that sparkling hall filled with the scents of expensive perfumes and the clinking of chips, casually placing a bet on red, and walking away with $1 million, leaving the dealer with their mouth agape? Usually, such stories end with empty pockets and a long walk home, because the math is always on the house's side. But there was one man who proved that you can use not magic or bad luck against the casino, but simple physics and a little observation. His name was Joseph Jagder, and he lived not in the age of computers and hidden cameras, but in the second half of the 19th century, 1773 to be exact. Joseph was an ordinary engineer at a rolling mill in Yorkshire. You know, the kind of person who tinkered all day with mechanical machines, listened to the creaking gears, and knew everything about how metal wears down. One day, sitting over a pint of ale, he thought, listen, roulette is just like a machine. It has an axis, a wheel, a ball, and no machine in the world, no matter how perfect it is, can operate forever without flaws. There's always a microscopic tilt, scratch, or speck of dust that makes it spin just a little unevenly. Jagder understood something brilliant. If a roulette wheel is not perfectly balanced, and back then they were all made by hand, that means the ball should statistically more often land in certain sectors. Not always, but statistically more often. This was not a game of luck. It was a game of flaws and manufacturing. But how could he prove his theory? He needed a testing ground. Joseph chose the most luxurious place on earth, the casino in Monte Carlo. He saved up some money, took a vacation, hired 6 ordinary clerks as assistants, and headed to the French Riviera. Imagine this scene. 6 unassuming individuals walk into the Monte Carlo casino. They do not drink champagne, make bets, or flirt with the ladies. They simply stand by 6 roulette tables with notebooks and pencils every day from morning till evening, recording the numbers that come up. One spin, another. Thousands. Of course, the casino looked at them suspiciously, but they were not playing. They were just standing and writing. After a month, Joseph gathered all the notebooks and sat down to analyze mountains of numbers. 5 roulette wheels performed perfectly, no pattern. But the 6th wheel, bingo. Jagger found what he was looking for. 9 numbers, 7, 8, 9, 17, 18, 19, 22, 28, and 29 came up significantly more often than others. A slight misalignment of the axle, a tiny speck of dust invisible to the eye, or a scratch on the bearing. The next day, Joseph returned to the casino. He approached that very 6th table and began to bet exclusively on his 9 lucky numbers. Listen, it was a massacre. In just one day, he won an astronomical sum. The croupiers changed, and the managers were nervous. The second day he came back and won again. Over the course of a few days, he drew so much money from Monte Carlo that the casino was on the brink of bankruptcy. The rumor of the lucky Englishman spread throughout Europe. The casino owners were in a panic. They realized he was not cheating. He wasn't even touching the wheel. But how was he doing it? The casino decided to outsmart Joseph. At night, they simply swapped the roulette wheels. The 6th wheel was placed at another table. The next day, Jagger returned to his usual spot, placed his bets on his favorite numbers, and started losing. 1 loss. 2. 3. He was confused. What happened? Then his engineering eye caught a tiny scratch on the wooden rim of the roulette. He understood. This was not his wheel. He began to walk around the hall, peering at the other tables, and found his lucky roulette with that same scratch. Calmly, he sat down at it and began to clear the bank again. The casino owners gave up. They paid him all his winnings, an enormous sum for those times, enough to ensure a comfortable life until old age. After that, they completely revised the standards for producing their roulette wheels, implementing daily balancing of the wheels using water levels. And Joseph Jagger returned to Yorkshire, bought real estate, and never gambled again in his life. He was not a gambler. He was an engineer who simply solved a mathematical problem with the help of a notebook and keen observation. Honestly, this story always amazes me with how a clear mind can defeat a system built on human gambling and hope for miracles. This is story number 19, how one accountant saved the planet by purchasing an entire mountain of garbage. Listen, have you ever thought that boring office workers have a secret superpower? We usually imagine them with piles of paperwork, perpetually displeased faces, and calculators in hand. But here's a story about Leonard Knight, a man who proved that if you have a dream and faith in goodness, even an ordinary dump can become something, let's say, divine. It was the early 80s, the California desert. A place where the heat is so intense that the air shimmers like a painting. Leonard Knight was an average worker, and one day, completely unexpectedly, he decided that he needed to celebrate love. But not with words, no. He wanted to build something magnificent that the whole world could see. He resolved to make a gift to God. Can you imagine the scale? He found a spot in the scorched earth where there used to be an old landfill. Rusty pieces of metal, broken bottles, remnants of old cars, plastic debris were everywhere. Another person would have simply walked past and cleaned their shoes, but Leonard took a brush and bags of clay in his hands. Listen, this went on for almost 30 years. 30! He lived in the back of an old truck, ate whatever he could find, slept under the stars, and every day at dawn he set out to work. He collected everything that others threw away. Old tires, car frames, piles of rubbish that lay nearby. And he didn't just dump it in a heap. He transformed the garbage into a massive mountain rising above the desert, adorned with incredible patterns. He used 1,000 liters of the cheapest paint he could get: pink, yellow, blue, green. He painted words on the walls of his palace. God is love, drawing hearts, flowers, and clouds. The desert, which had previously been gray and dreary, suddenly exploded with colors. It became the brightest spot on the state map, visible even from space. You know what's most astonishing? He did this entirely selflessly. When people came to him asking how much it cost to enter, he simply smiled and shook his head. It's free, completely free. Look, rejoice, this is for everyone. Local authorities initially tried to remove him, saying, "Leonard, you've turned this place into a dump. You need to leave." But when people started traveling to the desert from all over the world to see this crazy bright mountain, officials realized they could not tear down this wonder. The mountain made of garbage, transformed into a sanctuary of love, became a national treasure. Leonard Knight passed away a few years ago, but his mountain of salvation still stands. Millions of tourists walk along his handmade paths among painted tires and rusty remains, feeling something that brings tears to their eyes. A man who had not a penny in his pocket made thousands believe that love is not an abstract concept, but a very real mountain in the middle of the desert. Honestly, this story always reminds me that we ourselves choose what fills our lives, junk or meaning. And if Leonardo managed to create something beautiful from a pile of rusty iron, then we have no excuses not to make the world just a little brighter, right? This is story number 20, how a jukebox saved a small town from quiet extinction. Have you ever been to places where time seems to have decided to stop and take a nap in the shade of an old oak tree? There are tiny settlements where every other house is empty, and young people leave in search of big cities, leaving only silence and dust behind. One of these places is the town of Hardy, right in the heart of the American state of Arkansas. Well, people lived there, cows were tended, newspapers were read, but life, slipped away like water from a leaky bucket. One day, in the late 90s, a guy drove into this town. He was neither a millionaire nor a messiah, just a traveling craftsman who repaired everything that made sounds, from old radios to forgotten phonographs in attics. He stopped in the town square, looked at the nearly empty plaza, and suddenly thought, why don't we create a real attraction here? And he didn't build a Disneyland. No, he started by finding an old, rust-eaten jukebox at the local dump. You know, those giant boxes where you used to drop a coin to listen to jazz? He spent 3 months digging through endless wires, gears, and circuits. He didn't just fix it, he transformed that jukebox into something alive. When he plugged it in and dropped a coin, the whole town didn't just hear music. An old record with a hit from the 40s suddenly played so clearly and richly it felt like an orchestra was performing right around the corner. But it wasn't just about the sound. The craftsman built a bunch of mechanisms inside. As the music played, little wooden figures came to life: dancers, musicians, even a tiny clerk with a sealed cash register. It was a whole mechanical theater. Townspeople who hadn't seen anything in years beyond their neighbors' fences poured into the square. Can you imagine their faces? People who had grown used to dullness suddenly witnessed a celebration spring forth from an old piece of iron. That thing became the town's mascot. Every Saturday, people gathered around, dropped coins, drank lemonade, and started to talk. You see, it was the magic of communication. Before, they just walked by, nodding to each other, but now there was music, laughter, and discussions on how amazing that little wooden dancer was moving. The town came alive. Cafe owners opened their doors and set out tables. Tourists passing by on the highway began to take detours into Hardy. Of course, the singing box was there. The town started making money, and young people stopped leaving because it became fun. The craftsman left after 6 months, but the jukebox remained. And you know what's the most amazing part? That very box still stands there, in the center of the town. Of course, it is constantly touched up, cleaned, and cared for as if it were a beloved child. From an ordinary pile of junk, it turned into the heart of an entire community. Sometimes I feel like we all need a little music box in our lives. something that encourages us to step outside, put down our phones, and just stand next to our neighbor, listening to an old record. By the way, do you have an odd but beloved local treasure in your city or neighborhood? Maybe some statue that everyone dresses up in a hat during winter? Or an old lamp that mysteriously flickers? It's these little things that make up real life, isn't it? Here's story number 21. How one button from a coat almost sent a person into space and beyond. Have you ever thought that something as ordinary as a button could become the center of an entire universe? Literally. We often overlook them until one pops off at the most inconvenient moment. Then life turns into a real quest. Now, picture a story that took place in one of the secret laboratories somewhere across the ocean in the 1950s, when people were obsessed with space and anything resembling flight. There was an engineer there, let's call him Arthur. He was working on a project studying how to behave under conditions of complete isolation. Preparing people for long flights to the stars. Arthur decided to conduct an experiment. He locked himself in a simulator chamber to test how the human brain copes with absolute solitude and silence. All he had with him were the bare essentials, everything checked off the list, all by the rules. On the second day of his solitude, a button popped off his coat. It seemed trivial, but in conditions of sensory deprivation, when nothing is happening around you, the brain starts clinging to the slightest stimulus. Arthur looked at that button, then at the thread that remained, and it took off from there. This wasn't madness, it was a creative explosion. He began to deconstruct that button to its atomic level. Seriously. He studied its structure, tried to understand how it was made, what it was cast from. Then he started using it as a tool. He learned to play some incredible, only he could understand games with that button and thread. He tied it to different corners of the chamber, creating intricate geometric shapes. He made that button fly around the room, creating the illusion of movement when his eyelids were starting to twitch from boredom. He began to invent a whole story for that button. It became not just a piece of plastic, but a messenger from another planet. He gave it names, told it about his life, even staged mini theatrical performances for it. I swear, if someone had seen him through the surveillance camera at that moment, they would have thought Arthur had completely lost it. But he was perfectly sane, and after 2 weeks, they released him from the chamber. Arthur emerged, unkempt, with wild eyes, yet incredibly calm. The doctors rushed to him, expecting to see a person on the brink of a breakdown, and he handed them that very button and said, "Guys, I just conducted a study that will change your understanding of survival psychology." It turned out that his brain, deprived of external information, not only began to hallucinate, but transformed an ordinary button into an anchor of reality. It prevented him from going insane, becoming a foothold in the endless void. This was his personal pocket universe. By the way, this story was studied for a long time in universities. It became clear that under conditions of severe isolation, any object, even a simple button, can become an entire world for us if we put enough effort into breathing meaning into it. Honestly, I am always amazed by this human ability to find light and meaning where it seems there are only shadows. Story number 22. How an ordinary plumber discovered an entire world beneath his house. Listen, have you ever caught yourself thinking that we live on the surface, like on a chest lid, without even realizing what is hidden inside? Here is William Little. In London, he was nicknamed the Mole Man. He knew for certain that the earth beneath his feet was not just dirt, it was alive, pliable. It was waiting for someone to decide to pierce it. And the funniest thing is that he did not do it for science or fame. No, he just wanted peace and quiet. It was the mid-20th century. William lived in a typical London suburb. One day, he was terribly annoyed by noise. You know how it is. Neighbors arguing loudly, dogs barking, cars driving by. In short, the life of a big city was overwhelming his ears. And one evening, when his nerves were already frayed, he picked up an ordinary steel shovel, went down to his basement, and began to dig. Listen carefully. He didn't intend to do this forever. He thought he would dig a small storage room for his tools to hide from the world. But when he made the first shovelful, he felt a thrill he had never experienced in his life. The ground yielded easily, and he decided to dig a bit more, then a bit more, then to the side. This mole man spent 40 years beneath his house. 40, can you imagine? He dug an entire labyrinth, not just a hole, but real tunnels with rounded arches, with rooms and ventilation that he designed himself. He removed the soil at night in small bags so that no one would guess what he was doing. Neighbors noticed he was a bit strange, always dirty, but no one could imagine that right beneath their feet was an entire underground city being built. He was self-taught, but his tunnels were so sturdy that they were later studied by professional engineers. And you know what is the most astonishing? In his underground halls, the temperature was always perfect. He even created something resembling a library and a workshop down there. He had his own personal world where no sound from the surface could penetrate. No cries, no cars. When he was finally discovered, accidentally, when one of the streets sagged a bit, the city officials were shocked. They descended and saw a system of tunnels that stretched for hundreds of meters. It looked like a set for a film about dwarves. And all of this was created by one elderly man with a single shovel and incredible patience. They made him fill it all back in, of course, for safety and all that. But think about it. He was happy. A man simply wanted peace, and in the end, he built something that legends will be told about for centuries to come. To be honest, this story always reminds me that we often complain about our neighbors or noise, but we never change anything. But William took a shovel and created his own silence. Sometimes I feel that within each of us lives a little mole who wants to hide from the hustle and bustle of the world in his own, albeit underground, paradise. Story number 23. How a chance walk on the beach gifted the world a tiny lord of crystals. Have you ever thought that an ordinary seaside shore is not just a place to sunbathe and collect shells? Sometimes, if you have a keen eye and, let's say, a somewhat obsessive mindset, the beach becomes a real treasure trove. Here's a story about a man who, while walking along the shore in northern England, accidentally saw something that millions of people pass by without even turning their heads. His name was Albert Barker, a man who worked his entire life in a factory, but in his heart, he was a true alchemist. Now, imagine it. 1950. Fog. Cold sand. The cries of seagulls. He walks along the water and suddenly notices a tiny transparent stone. Ordinary glass. Just trash. He picks it up, wipes it with his fingers, holds it up to the light, and breathes in sharply. This was not just a stone. It was an entire world trapped in a tiny crystal. Do you understand what the deal was? In those places, for decades, even centuries, ocean waves had been methodically grinding tons of trash, old bottles, and broken ceramics. And this sand worked like a giant natural grinding machine. The ocean turned sharp shards into soft, frosted, perfectly smooth pieces of glass. But Albert was not just a craft enthusiast. He started collecting these gifts from the ocean and decided to give them a voice. He started creating micro-pictures from them. You won't believe it, but he took tweezers and a tiny lens and assembled these glass pieces into incredible mosaics right on matchbox covers. Imagine a picture no bigger than a fingernail depicting a sailing ship, a castle, or even a portrait of a queen, and all of it made from bits of glass found on the shore. Listen, this was the work of a surgeon, a jeweler, and a madman rolled into one. One wrong move and the picture would fall apart. He sat for hours, weeks, in the silence of his tiny home, gluing what was once a broken beer bottle into something for which collectors today are willing to pay a fortune. When he first displayed his work at a local fair, people were simply stunned. They looked at these matchbox creations through magnifying glasses and couldn't understand how it was possible. How could such beauty be pulled from a pile of trash that each of them had trampled underfoot? Albert became a local legend. He was called the Glass Wizard. He did not ask for vast sums of money. He just wanted people to look beneath their feet and see that the world around them is not a dump, but a storehouse of materials for wonders. The funniest thing is that many tried to repeat what he did afterward. Thousands of people gathered on the same beach, searching for the same bits of glass, trying to glue, cut, and assemble them. But, nothing came of it. There was no spark, no gaze that could discern a masterpiece among the trash. Frankly, this story always reminds me that we often overlook amazing things because our brains are tuned to search for something useful and valuable. We look for gold, diamonds, success. Meanwhile, beauty lies right beneath our feet, disguised as broken glass and old fragments. Story number 24. How two Italian cobblers built an invisible bridge just to visit each other. Have you ever caught yourself thinking that some people live in such geographical confusion that to visit a neighbor they must cross the national border 3 times? And this is not from a fairy tale or a computer game. In reality, in the very heart of Europe, there is a little town called Barle. It's divided between Belgium and the Netherlands, with the borders running right through living rooms, kitchens, and even children's beds. Can you imagine this absurdity? But the story I want to tell you happened a bit earlier, when the officials had not yet surrounded everything with barbed wire and put up signs. 2 neighbors lived there, 2 cobblers, let's call them Pierre and Jan. Pierre lived on the Belgian side, while Jan lived on the Dutch side. A stream flowed between them, with planks thrown across so they wouldn't wet their feet. One day, after an especially rainy autumn, the stream overflowed, turning into a real river, making it impossible to get to each other's houses. Just at that moment, Pierre had run out of leather for shoe soles, and Jan had a great adhesive that both needed. They could have stayed home and grumbled about the weather, but they were cobblers and men of action. They looked at the map, then at the stream, then at each other, and decided to build a bridge. But not just any bridge, a bridge that no customs office in the world could contest. They built it themselves, by hand, out of old oak planks they got from a nearby sawmill. Listen, it turned out to be a masterpiece of engineering, built on pure stubbornness. They didn't just connect the banks, they made the bridge diplomatic. In the middle of the bridge, they painted a thin white line and agreed that if either of them was going to visit the other, they would officially leave one country and enter another, as if passing through passport control. They even introduced their own currency for crossing the bridge, 1 portion of freshly brewed coffee. Do you know how this changed the town? Neighbors started coming over just to see this marvel. Then they began asking for permission to build their own little bridges. Barle became a whole network of cobblers' bridges. People began visiting each other more often than they did their own shops. It was a world where the border existed only in the mind and manifest as a chalk line drawn on old planks. This went on for several years until one day real border guards showed up. They, of course, were shocked. They wanted to tear everything down, arrest the cobblers for illegal border crossing, and build proper checkpoints with booths. But the townspeople took to the streets. They stood around those bridges like a living shield. They said, "You can put up fences here, but you will never be able to stop us from being friends across the stream." Surprisingly, the authorities backed down. They realized that fighting against 2 shoemakers who simply wanted to exchange leather for boots was a futile endeavor. The bridges were left standing, and they still remain there, reminding all of us that borders are merely lines on paper that can be erased if people just want to be a little closer to one another. Honestly, this story always reminds me that any wall can be turned into a bridge if you have the desire to work with your hands and a bit of common sense. Story number 25. How an ordinary diver saved the cathedral by descending into the murky abyss. Listen, have you ever thought about what holds our world together? We are accustomed to asphalt, concrete, and sturdy walls. But what if I told you that one of the greatest architectural wonders of England, Winchester Cathedral, almost became a pile of dust due to plain water and a couple of oak piles? It was not a great engineer with diplomas who saved it, but a humble diver who spent 6 months crawling along the bottom like a blind mole. This took place in the early 20th century. The cathedral had already stood for more than a century. Majestically, it stood, stone and proud, while beneath it lay a swamp. Yes, a real, damp, treacherous swamp. In the Middle Ages, the builders were cunning. They drove thousands of huge oak logs into the silt to create a foundation. These piles held the cathedral for hundreds of years. But then civilization came along. The groundwater level dropped, the water receded, the wood began to rot, and the stones of the cathedral started to crack. the walls began to move apart. Just a little more, and this historical monument would have collapsed right onto the heads of the parishioners. Engineers were at a loss. How do you replace the foundation of a building that is on the verge of crumbling, with a mix of silt and rotten boards underneath? All predictions were pessimistic. And then William Walker appeared. Imagine, an ordinary diver in a heavy iron helmet and rubber suit. He descended into the shaft that had been dug under the walls of the cathedral, where there was complete darkness, a soupy sludge in which nothing was visible beyond his own nose. Walker had to work literally by feel. Half an hour after half an hour, day after day for a whole 6 years. Can you imagine that? 6 years in darkness beneath enormous walls in water that was about to close in. Walker removed rotten logs, one after another, and replaced them with new concrete blocks. And all of this was done by touch, without any blueprints, without the ability to check the results. If he had been off by even a millimeter, if the wall had shifted, it would have been the end. He would have been buried alive beneath the cathedral. He worked like a jeweler, except instead of a table, he had a muddy pit filled with murky water. When he finally finished, the walls of the cathedral were back in place, the cracks sealed up, and the building stood still in its proud beauty. Almost no one knew about him. He was just a diver who did his job and left. No medals on his chest, no grand speeches. Only after many years did people realize, this is not a miracle, nor divine providence that held the stones, but the iron nerves of the man who crawled for 6 years in order for us to admire the vaults of this cathedral. Today, to be honest, this story always gives me chills. We walk the streets, admire buildings, monuments, and beauty, and do not even suspect how many invisible feet stand behind every brick. How many people, like Walker, silently bore the world on their shoulders while others simply sip tea? Have you ever done work that no one noticed, but which was critically important for the common good? Perhaps you quietly organized documents in the archive, or planted flowers in the flower bed by the entrance so everyone could enjoy them. Those were small feats too, right? Story number 26. How a botanist spy in a braid stole the tea secret from an entire empire. Listen. Have you ever considered that your morning cup of tea is essentially the result of the largest industrial espionage in the history of humanity? We tend to think that tea has always been around, but in fact, back in the middle of the 19th century, China was an absolute monopoly. They held the secret of how to grow this bush, how to harvest, how to dry it, and they guarded it as if it were not a plant, but the philosopher's stone. Britain, which was going crazy over tea, paid China ridiculous amounts of silver, and at some point, the English realized, either they steal the secret or their economy would simply burst. Enter Robert Fortune, not just a scientist, but a true adventurer at heart. He was a botanist but looked and acted like a hero from James Bond novels. His mission was to sneak into the depths of China, where entry for foreigners was strictly forbidden under the threat of death. His task? To steal the best seedlings and, most importantly, to learn the leaf processing technology. Imagine him. He hires a barber, shaves off his European hair, grows a long queue, dons silk robes, and learns the Chinese language to such an extent that even locals took him for a merchant from the countryside. He takes with him only a trunk for samples, a bit of food, and, amusingly enough, a large supply of dog food for his dog who traveled with him. Listen, he navigated mountain passes, slept in hovels, drank terrible rice, and was constantly terrified of being exposed. If anyone had seen him carefully wrapping the tea seedlings at night to keep them from freezing, he would have been executed on the spot. He collected seeds, hired local masters who secretly showed him the drying and fermentation process, and then, how did he export them? He packed the seedlings in special glass boxes, a sort of portable greenhouses, to ensure they survived the long sea journey around Africa. When he finally returned to India and planted the stolen seedlings on plantations, he accomplished what is today called the greatest plant relocation. The Chinese monopoly collapsed. Tea became available to everyone, from the London clerk to the street vendor. Do you know what is the most ironic part? This man, who endured hell for the sake of science and empire, became almost forgotten by the end of his life. He simply returned home, published his diaries, and quietly passed away in his garden among his favorite plants. No medals on his chest, no noisy parades, just a guy who once decided that a scythe and the ability to stay silent at the right moment were more important than the laws of a foreign country. To be honest, this story always amazes me by how profoundly one person, armed with enough audacity and love for their craft, can change the habits of millions. Today, we don't even think about why tea is so cheap and sold in every little shop. Yet, behind each pack, there are thousands of miles, risks, and one very convincing sight. Story number 27. How an entire orchestra of old things saved the village of Vandak from silence. Have you ever caught yourself thinking that life in the mountains, at an altitude of 4,000 meters, can be incredibly quiet? A complete silence that presses on your ears. Silence that could drive you insane if you were born in the rhythm of a big city. In Paraguay, in a god-forsaken village called Catura, people lived among piles of garbage. Literally, this place was the main dump for a huge metropolis nearby. Children here would often skip school to collect metal, plastic, and cardboard to somehow help their families survive. One day, a music teacher named Fabio Chas appeared there. He had neither money for instruments nor wealthy sponsors. His students, kids from the dump, looked at him with such disbelief, as if he had fallen from another planet. He wanted to teach them to play Bach, Mozart, Vivaldi, while they sometimes didn't even have bread at home. Fabio looked at their hands that were only used to digging in the dirt and understood. A classical violin here costs as much as a house. This is simply impossible. But he was a man who believed. Music is inside, not in the wood of the instrument. And then he had a light bulb moment. He noticed an old master named Kola who could fix anything. They went to the dump and started searching for treasure. Listen, it was real magic transforming junk into art. They found old metal fuel tanks. They turned into magnificent cellos. They found old drainage pipes. Those became flutes. Someone discarded cookie boxes, which they turned into guitars. They bent forks and attached them to necks to create string holders. Do you know what they made violins from? Ordinary tin cans from paint, while the necks were made from pieces of old wood that lay in the dirt. When the children picked up these instruments, none of them knew how to play. They had never seen real music before, but when they first drew the bow across the steel wire strings, you should have seen their faces. This wasn't the sound of junk. It was a sound that penetrated to the bone. The violins made from paint cans sang so clearly that grown men who had worked on the dump their entire lives wiped tears away with dirty sleeves. They named their project the Orchestra of Recycled Instruments. At first, they played in the backyards for neighbors, and then they were invited to Europe. Can you imagine that scene? Children who just yesterday were collecting bottles, stepping onto the stage in Barcelona, in Paris, in Tokyo. They play the most complex classical works, and the audience sits there in disbelief. Could this sound really be coming from an old pipe and a tin can? They traveled the world, performed with the best orchestras, and were featured in the news. And it wasn't just about becoming stars. It was about how Fabio didn't just give them music, he gave them hope. He showed that it doesn't matter where you start. What matters is what you can create from what you have on hand. You know, every time I watch recordings of their performances, I catch myself thinking about how often we justify our laziness with a lack of the right conditions. Yet these young people took a piece of rusty pipe and made it weep like a living heart. Honestly, this story makes you look at the trash can in a whole new way. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you lacked resources for something important, and instead you just took what was lying around and crafted a solution? Story number 28. How a pedantic pharmacist taught humanity how to understand the language of clouds. Listen, have you ever caught yourself just standing and looking at the sky? You know, when clouds float off somewhere, taking on peculiar shapes, and you try to guess whether they look more like a dog or a dragon. We all do it, but until the early 19th century, people simply referred to clouds as mists or smoke. No one knew they were different. No one understood why some heralded rain while others promised a clear sunny day. Enter Luke Howard, a pharmacist from London. Just picture it. A person who spends all day weighing powders, counting drops, and organizing vials. He seemed like the most boring person in the world, but Luke was the kind of person who saw the world as a vast system that needed organizing. While everyone else simply stared out the window, Luke began keeping a journal. Every single day, regardless of the weather, he wrote, "Okay, today, fluffy tufts. Tomorrow, long strands. The day after, a complete gray blanket." Listen, he was a true fanatic for order. He decided that clouds should have names, not just those things, but clear scientific names. He adopted Latin, a language that sounded serious. He conceived of cumulus clouds, those fluffy ones that resemble mounds of cotton. He named them cumulus. He came up with cirrus, thin and feather-like clouds that drift high up, and stratus for the layer upon layer that blankets the sky in gray veils. Do you understand what he did? He gave us a language so we could talk to the sky. Before him, no one could say, "Oh, today we'll have cirrus clouds, so it will get colder by evening." He took chaos and turned it into a table. But the funniest part is that when he published his work, the scientific community initially, well, let's say, didn't quite appreciate it. They were like, "Hey, pharmacist, are you serious? Clouds? Why not write about something important?" But just a couple of years later, everyone realized how brilliant it was. Sailors began to understand the weather. Farmers planned their crops, and scientists predicted storms. Howard unknowingly laid the foundation for modern meteorology. He did what philosophers had failed to do for thousands of years. He systematized the very emptiness. When he became famous, he didn't abandon his pharmacy. He remained a humble guy who would step out onto the porch of his home in the evenings, adjust his glasses, and jot down new observations in a notebook. By the way, his portrait still hangs in meteorological offices around the world. Frankly, this story always reminds me that to change science, you don't have to be a brilliant professor with a pile of accolades. Sometimes, it's enough to simply observe the world around you and have the courage to call things by their true names. Story number 29. How a mailbox at the edge of the world became the most reliable cloud storage without the internet. Listen, have you ever thought about how dependent we are on modern gadgets? We need everything at our fingertips, so the cloud can store our photos and messengers can hold our letters. But what if I told you that for 300 years, on a tiny island lost in the Pacific Ocean, there has been a postal service that operates without electricity, servers, or even specific addresses? Moreover, it has never failed in 3 centuries. Welcome to the Galapagos Islands, or more specifically, to a bay that sailors nicknamed the Mail Barrel. This place is so far from civilization that in the 15th and 16th centuries, whalers and explorers who went out to sea for many years had no way to send a message home. Can you imagine that longing? You are in the open ocean, thousands of miles from home, and the only thing that connects you to your family is the hope that one day you will return. So one of the captains decided to place a simple, rough wooden barrel on the shore. He nailed it to a tree and left a letter inside. The idea was simple. If you pass by, peek into the barrel. If you see a letter addressed to your port or country, take it and promise that when you get there, you will personally drop it into a mailbox or give it directly to the family. Listen, this was a system based purely on crystal clear trust. No stamps, no seals, no guarantees that your envelope wouldn't rot from moisture or end up in a bird's stomach. But imagine a sailor who hasn't seen his family in 2 years, takes another person's letter, keeps it in his cabin, protects it from rats and storms, and then, upon arriving in Liverpool or Lisbon, goes to the address and delivers the message to someone he doesn't even know. It was the most reliable cloud in human history. Thousands of letters passed through that barrel. People learned about the births of children, weddings, and that their loved ones were alive months after the letter was written. This system became so sacred that even during the fiercest wars, when pirates plundered everything, no one touched the mail barrel. It was an unwritten rule of the ocean: do not disturb the mail. And the most astonishing thing is that this barrel is still there. Of course, now it mainly attracts tourists who leave postcards for one another, but the tradition lives on. You can travel to the Galapagos Islands, leave a letter in the barrel, and there's a great chance that some traveler from another country will take it home and drop it into a real mailbox in your city. You know, there's something incredibly touching about that. Nowadays, we are in such a hurry that if a message doesn't get through in 1 second, we get anxious. But there, at the edge of the world, people have relied on the kindness of strangers and on patience for centuries. And it worked. Story number 30. How an entire forest in the state of Utah became the oldest and largest organism on the planet. Listen, have you ever walked through a forest and thought that each tree here is an individual resident? Each has its age, its story, its passport. We are used to thinking this way. This tree was planted by my father, that one by my grandfather, and here's a very young one. We see trees like people living alongside us. But what if I told you there's a place where this vast, sprawling forest is actually a single organism? Well, literally. In Utah, high in the mountains, there exists a grove of quaking aspens called Pando. That's what scientists name it. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary forest, over 40 hectares of golden leaves, tens of thousands of slender trunks rustling in the wind. Beautiful. Insanely beautiful. But here's the thing. If you start taking DNA samples from each tree in this grove, you will be astonished. Every single one has an absolutely identical genetic code. Listen closely. They are not brothers or sisters, and not even clones. This is one and the same organism. Imagine a gigantic network of roots that burrows deep into the ground. It's as if there's a vast, intricate electrical system powering everything above. These roots spread out across hectares, and from them, like some magical buds, new trunks constantly push up. When one trunk ages and falls, it doesn't die completely. Its roots continue to nourish the others, and in the spot of the old one, a new shoot quickly emerges. This being has been living, well, buckle up, for 80,000 years. 80,000. Just imagine, when this forest started to grow, humanity hadn't even thought about building the first cities. It has survived ice ages, the fall of some civilizations, and the rise of others. It has witnessed climate changes and the shifting appearance of the continent. While we argue about what will happen tomorrow, Pando stands there quietly rustling its leaves, watching how fleeting our hustle and bustle is. And the most incredible thing is it weighs about 6,000 tons. This is the heaviest living organism on Earth. Can you believe it? Not a whale, not an elephant, nor a giant sequoia, but this humble aspen grove that simply decided, why should I reproduce with seeds when I can spread my roots and occupy the entire surrounding space? Honestly, this story always makes me feel like such a tiny speck of time. We bustle about, rush somewhere, trying to leave a mark, while somewhere in the mountains of Utah stands this silent giant, remembering what no archive can recall. He did not build skyscrapers, he did not create currencies, and he did not write books. But he is still here. And every year, when autumn arrives, he dresses in gold just to remind us how important it is sometimes to stay grounded and take root. By the way, have you ever thought that we are all, in essence, very similar to these trees? After all, we also have common roots. Our ancestors, our stories, our memories that are passed down from generation to generation, even if we ourselves are quite different now. For it is this that makes us one, like this great forest, isn't it? Well, my dear friend, we have come to the end of our 30th chapter in this series. We have flown through the ages, visited deserts beneath the earth, the sea, and even the mountains. I hope you learned something today that will make you look at the world a little differently, with a spark of curiosity and a light smile. Please write in the comments which of these 30 stories resonated with you the most.